You're on.
So I want to welcome everyone to this Woods Zoom virtual tour in Hillside Woods with Patrick McKenzie. Patrick moved to Hastings very recently, and we're thrilled he's here. He's working on his PhD in plant evolution at Columbia University. He's our newest member of the Conservation Commission. He is extraordinarily knowledgeable about plants, both locally and in places as far-flung as China. And without further ado, just want to mention that at the end of the talk, if there's time for questions, please use your chat box and take it away, Patrick.
Thanks, Haven. And thanks for the introduction. I'm going to, I guess, introduce myself a little bit a second time, just in that I am new to Hastings. I'm also new to the Conservation Commission in Hastings. I'm a PhD student in plant evolution. And that's kind of my kind of entry-level qualifications for a talk like this. But the premise for this talk, I guess, is that I had kind of aspired to this spring be leading some bird walks or plant walks or something locally, either here in Hillside Woods or maybe in Central Park, where I do a lot of birding down in Manhattan. And of course, things have changed and I can't do that. And so here we are on a virtual tour of Hillside Woods. That's going to actually be part virtual tour, but also we'll have a lot of kind of information about the woods in general and also how to be a naturalist. And I consider myself to be an amateur naturalist in the sense that I actually don't know every plant species in the woods. I don't know every bird species in the woods. And that discredits me in one way, I think, but also I think hopefully makes this all seem much more accessible in the sense that it's pretty easy to learn the vast majority of the common species nearby with the help of books and the internet. So don't let your qualifications stop you from being a naturalist. And so I guess with that, I'll jump in to the Hillside Woods overview, part 1. I'm kind of thinking of this part as what I call a parking lot talk, which is when you're standing around with a bunch of people in the parking lot before you start your nature walk and kind of explain to them what to expect. So this is the virtual version of the parking lot talk. And it's important in Hillside Woods context to establish sort of the specialness of the woods to our area. And we all know, I think, in the Hastings area that there are a lot of imminent threats to our woods. And sometimes I'm afraid that there's a misconception around that there's very little life in the woods because of these imminent threats. And I just want to establish that that is very much not true. These woods are teeming with life, even though they are threatened. And part of the reason for this is because Hillside Woods is home to a variety of habitats. And so we have young forests, we have older forests, and running through them are streams. There are ponds that are both open and seasonal and wooded. We have wetlands, we have meadows, and we have cliff areas. And all of these places support different kinds of plants and animals that'll be living in a way that's specific to the kind of ecosystems that they prefer. And so maybe you'd expect to find barred owls and deer in deeper parts of the woods, where in the cliff-like areas you'll probably find more mosses like this, or some of these blooming wild pinks. I also want to say that the vast majority of photos that you'll see in this presentation were taken yesterday. And so what you're looking at is sort of the state of the woods as it is right now. And so despite being covered in life, Hillside Woods is threatened, and that is something that I do want to emphasize, at least briefly. It's threatened by overuse. And on one hand, that's a good thing. I love that people love our woods. But also there's kind of a ratio of the amount of resources we have to maintain the woods with the way and the amount that we use them. And so we have huge problems with trail erosion in the woods, and that's a combination of people biking through the woods, people walking in large groups through the woods, and then not being able to sustain a lot of ground cover because of some other threats. We also have a bunch of other human activities going on. Some of these stick huts seem pretty benign, but they're removing wood that should be decomposing on the ground, returning nutrients to the soil, and providing a habitat for decomposers like insects and herps. And then There are a lot of dogs running off leash through the woods, which again, can kind of at the surface level seem like something that's benign, but it's actually threatening an already fragile ecosystem, especially in early spring when plants are beginning to emerge, birds are nesting and mating, and we have resident barred owls that are trying to take naps. And the nature of our woods is going to operate best when we're not disturbing it and running all over it. We all know, at least in the Hastings area, that overpopulation of deer in Westchester County is also a threat to the woods. And this is because deer keep the understory picked clean of native plants. And by doing that, they create an environment that actually favors invasive plants, which tend to be much more aggressive than native plants, and deer tend to not like them as much. And then I guess a corollary is that Hillside Woods is then threatened by invasives. And when we think of invasive species, we usually think of big plants that we can see. And so on the left here, we have privet, which is a kind of landscaping shrub that has escaped to native habitats and grows all over the place. We have Norway maples all over our woods right now. We have Phragmites, which grows in wetlands. And then something that you might not think of when you think of invasive species are invasive pests and diseases. So in the top left here, I'm holding a sprig of hemlock, which is one of, I think, 2 hemlock trees in Hillside Woods that's growing next to Sugar Pond. And lining the stem, you can see these little white dots, which are signs that the hemlock woolly adelgid is growing on this tree. And this is a little bug that is causing a lot of, I think, havoc across the US, and it's probably going to kill our little hemlock tree. So that's a huge downer, all of it. And luckily there are remediation efforts taking place. And these remediation efforts are being driven in large part by Parks and Rec. They're being driven by Conservation Commission with a lot of support from the city, and also a lot of support from county parks with Taro and Sarah helping us out, and volunteer efforts. And so as you're walking around the woods, you'll see a lot of stumps from Norway maples that have been cut down. And you'll also see some lopped vines, probably from volunteer efforts led by Haven Colgate and Susan Harris. And in one particular place, you'll see a whole bunch of brush piles and cut privet. And so this is kind of a first step that looks a little ugly in the short term, that I think is going to lead to, I think, a long-term remediation of the woods. So I tried to fly through that so that we could get to actually the process of being a naturalist in Hillside Woods, which is a pretty easy thing to do. But I think we should start with why be a naturalist, which is, I think, a natural question to ask, like why is this important? But it has a really complicated answer and probably deserves its own talk. And so rather than give a whole talk about why be a naturalist, I think this picture is kind of a good indication of something that is happening in Hillside Woods right now that people might not notice if they're not in kind of a naturalist mindset. And so these leaves are leaves from trout lilies, which are spring ephemeral plants. And I think if you're going along kind of your ordinary day, not paying attention to the plants and the animals around you, your walk in Hillside Woods looks pretty much the same day after day. If you're paying attention closely to the plants around you, you see these leaves coming out of the ground, and you get the joy of knowing that spring is on its way. And a month from now, these plants won't be here, so you can kind of enjoy the beauty of the woods, maybe in a more broad way than if you aren't paying attention to the plants and the animals. I'm sure your next question after why be a naturalist is, how do I be a naturalist? And so I've assembled a naturalist starter pack that hopefully you would all be carrying with you if we were meeting in person. And actually that's not true. I think the main part of the starter pack that you need to pay attention to, at least at first, ironically, is the cell phone. And this is something that's really counterintuitive, but I think is maybe the most important tool for helping you really quickly acquaint yourself with some of the natural life around us. And the reason for that is that when you're out in nature, you're usually wanting to move from place to place kind of quickly. And cell phones are great for leaning down, taking a couple pictures, and then once you get home, exploring, what is that plant that I saw? Or what is that bug that I saw? And I think the combination of the cell phone and Google will get you a lot farther, a lot faster, at least in the beginning of being a naturalist, than field guides. But that being said, there are great field guides out. I'm not going to walk through them, but if you're interested, you can come back to this recorded presentation later and skip to this slide and buy them all. They're great books. And then finally, for birding, binoculars are really important, but I think they can seem like a barrier to people sometimes because they can get really expensive. And if you go online and say, which binoculars should I get? People will tell you that you should buy like a $400 pair of binoculars. And I just really want to emphasize the point that that is not true at all. The point of binoculars is to magnify something that's far away. And even the cheapest binoculars do that really well. And so I put this binoculars example there because I actually bought this exact pair of binoculars very recently. And they were $60. And you can get great binoculars even cheaper than that. These binoculars work really great. I'm glad I bought them. And then our final question before we actually start our walk is, how do I find birds and how do I find plants? And there are a couple key points. The first of which is to be outside consistently. I think part of what separates nature from being in a zoo is that there's this big element of chance. And so I think sometimes people get discouraged when they go outside one time and don't see like that one bird that they really wanted to see. But part of being a naturalist is not just to see nature the first time you go out, but to experience nature, I think, more consistently by going outside repeatedly and seeing life change in front of you, and just spending more time in nature. Another key point is to look up for birds and then sometimes down. And this is obvious, but at the same time, it is important to be really conscious of the fact that there's a lot of activity happening right over your head. And people, if you're like looking straight at the trail in front of you, you're going to miss a lot of the life around you. And then moving through different habitats is another essential component to finding birds. And I think it's something that Hillside Woods has a huge advantage in because, although Hillside Woods is threatened by habitat degradation, it has a lot of different habitats. And I think in a lot of cases, moving through all these different habitats will let you see a lot more different things than, for example, moving through pristine woods that are pretty ubiquitous throughout. And then finally, you're going to walk slowly, always much slower than you think you should be walking, and you should be listening. You don't have to be listening for like that one specific bird song. It's most important to just be able to know that there is a bird around you so that you can swivel around and look at it. So then the list for how do I find plants is very similar, although you're going to want to look down more than you'll want to look up, and you don't have to listen for plants. And then a final point that I wanted to make was that birding and botanizing can be, and usually is, a serendipitous. You approach it serendipitously, like, oh, I wanted to go out into the woods and see what I find. But in some cases, it can be targeted. And so we have tools for recording observations in different areas that help people, for example, in this photo, find a rare bird when it arrives. And so this is from 2018 in Central Park when a Kirtland's warbler arrived. And I think a lot of people in New York City realized that this might be their one opportunity in their lives to see this bird. And so people crowded around it. And it's something that is, a little distressing, but, the ability to target different species is important for my work in particular, because I'm often trying to go out and find interesting populations of plants for my research. But it can also help you find like types of birds. If you want to see a woodpecker, you're not going to want to go to, a lake or something. So I guess with all of that introduction, now is finally the beginning of our actual virtual tour. And first of all, I should thank Adam Hart, our local Hastings resident artist and musician and map maker, for providing us with this beautiful map. We have kind of an updated version of it that we're working on that'll come out pretty soon. But it's really great to have the layout of the trails in the context of the geology of the park for example, thinking about stuff like this. And so we're going to start at the tennis courts, which I think is usually where people enter the park by Jim Kapoor. And this is an example of an edge type of habitat, which is actually a pretty important kind of habitat for being a naturalist. Edge habitats tend to be really abundant with life. So when you walk out of your car in the parking lot, you hear birds around you. It might not surprise you that there are a high proportion of invasive plants here. So we have a Paulownia tree that's hanging over the parking lot. We have this weird little population of Japanese maples that are persistent, kind of on the east side of a parking lot. And then on the trails around the parking lot, you can see some of our remediation work led by Taro and Sarah with county parks and our own Parks and Rec. But this is still like a really special place for the birding wise because of the undergrowth beside the trail leading away from the tennis courts, and then also the thicket behind the tennis courts. And these places are great habitats for white-throated sparrows and song sparrows and chickadees, which are pretty common birds. You'll see them at bird feeders a lot of the time, but it's really great to see them kind of away and in their own habitat. And they're great entry birds too, I think. But of course, we want to move along into Hillside Woods. And so next we're going to go to Sugar Pond, which I think a lot of people consider to be kind of the most iconic feature of Hillside Woods. And so Sugar Pond is a really special place. It supports water-loving birds like ducks and great blue herons and kingfishers, all of which are being seen pretty regularly there right now. I think one of the most special sights to me in Hillside Woods is when it gets really late and the sun's going down over Sugar Pond. If you're waiting around right at that time, wood ducks fly in right over the treetops and they hit the water right in front of this Phragmites patch at the back and swim right into the Phragmites. And so they're pretty, they're hard birds to find. They're really beautiful. And you can see them kind of in the near darkness most days. We also have trout lilies, native plants that I mentioned earlier, that are starting to bloom right now by Sugar Pond. And they're kind of hard to find. You can find the leaves all over the place, but finding the actual flowers is a little challenging. So you can place some Where's Waldo in the woods for those. And then we have a lot of undergrowth nearby, including this big Phragmites patch, which is kind of troublesome, but they all help support native birds to some extent. So you'll see a lot of red-winged blackbirds in the Phragmites. You'll see a lot of woodpeckers. There's one that's nesting right now, I think, in a dead tree near there. And so next, we're going to kind of walk up along the side of Sugar Pond, but then we're going to hang along the stream below the higher trail up to this place called Three Island Pond and the Judson Avenue entrance. And this is my personal favorite part of the park, I think. Here we have like a really, we have a really good combination of deep woods habitats and water. And this makes for a special kind of habitat for native plants like skunk cabbage, which is impossible to miss right now, as well as the trout lilies that I already showed you, and little ferns that are starting to come up nearby. And then we have some really great native birds like hermit thrushes that are pretty common in this part of the park. And I've seen pileated woodpeckers there before, which is a really special treat, I think. Two consistently cool things in this part of the park as well are one, the presence of this big tree, which you can see from the trail, which I think is the second hemlock tree in Hillside Woods. And you can identify it pretty easily right now because the trees are still not fully leafed out. And so you can see the one evergreen tree kind of through the overstory canopy. And then we also have a pair of resident barred owls right now. And pretty much anytime, every day, if you go through this part of the woods and look hard enough, you can find these owls. So now we're going to zip on along up to a higher part of the woods to the cliff tops. So on your way there, you're going to go through a deep woods part of the park. Here there's some trail erosion, but this part of the park is actually pretty special to me. I call this junction Woodpecker Junction, and as the name implies, every time you walk through here, you are surrounded by sounds of red-bellied woodpeckers making calls or knocking on trees. And they're really fun, charismatic, big birds. Once you get up to the cliff tops, it's cool to watch the canopy open up. And then we're left with an understory that's made up of rocks and mossy ground. And so there's some white pines growing nearby. These white pines tend to be full of birds all the time. Lately, I've seen yellow-rumped warblers in these pines. And then there's some blooming wild pinks nearby, which are an important early nectar source for our butterflies, and they're beautiful, that are growing up on the rocks. And then we have six-spotted tiger beetles, a native beetle that is really beautiful, and you'll be amazed by how fast it is as you approach it. Like, this picture is so grainy because I could only get a picture of it from really far away. But they really love to hang out on the surfaces of rocks on sunny, warm days. So now we're going to quickly walk over to Brittle Pond, which is a special habitat, and that is a seasonal wetland. Brittle Pond is also threatened by kind of abundant invasive species in this area. So we have a lot of stilt grass growing down here, we have Phragmites, and we have a lot of privet growing nearby as well. And these things are particularly threatening for these kind of seasonal pools because they're known to harbor, a lot of interesting life, including amphibian life. So if you're there late, kind of on a warm day, you'll hear Brittle Pond like teeming with sounds of spring peepers, one of our native tiny frogs. And then also, if you look around nearby, you will find a lot of native plants. So we have dogwoods flowering right now. And then earlier in the year, this isn't from yesterday, we had a sapsucker that was resident in a tree nearby, which is a cool woodpecker that's not very abundant here. And so then our last stop of the walk is going to take us by the chimney, which is an important overlook stop, all the way to the meadow or pad, choose your favorite name. But this is going to represent our disturbed open habitat. I love the meadow because it has a dense understory and then these big patches of bare ground. And because of this, it's a really great birding place. You see, I think, white-throated sparrows and swamp sparrows in particular really just love the open ground that you get there. And it's also a great place to get good looks at our resident red-tailed hawks, which you can usually see circling over the park in other places. But here they like to perch in the trees that kind of overlook the meadow, I think because they like to hunt for little rodents running through the meadow. Of course, this is also the epicenter, I think, of invasive plant life in the park. We have privet, Isla minute-weed, stiltgrass, tree of heaven, Norway maples, and garlic mustards, and some surges and stuff. They're all abundant right here. And because of this, this area is a priority for our remediation efforts. And so you will see, you'll see big brush piles here, you'll see cut privet here, and already the look of the place has changed. And so hopefully we'll get that replanted with native plants soon. And then I did want to give a shout out to the chimney and the whole eastern side of the park, which are great. The chimney is a great overlook for big birds. And then the eastern side of the park is an old growth forest that is a really amazing place for birding. And I felt like it's like a little less accessible to people, so I didn't cover it in this talk, but it deserves the talk all of its own, I think. And so just like that, we are back at the tennis courts and done with our virtual tour. But even though we're done with our virtual tour, I want to encourage you to explore these places on your own and kind of make your own memories there, which is part of what being a naturalist is about. We've only been able to go over like a tiny fraction of the life that you can find in the park right now. And as the season progresses, there's going to be a lot of turnover. The trout lilies are spring ephemerals, but they'll be replaced by other native wildflowers later in the season. And so keep going out, keep exploring, and don't wait to get the field guides for your starter kit. Go ahead and download some apps that will help you with ID. So Seek by iNaturalist lets you take your phone out in nature and point it at things, and it'll immediately report to you what it thinks that thing is. So it's great for plants, and it's great for insects. Merlin Bird ID is an app by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it's hard to point your phone at a bird, and so they instead provide a series of questions like, how big is your bird? What colors are on the bird? And they'll give you a list of what you might be looking at with photos. It's really helpful. And then once you get great at that, or even before you get great at that, I shouldn't, there's no barrier here. iNaturalist and eBird are great ways to keep track of your observations. And they can act both as a journal for you to record the things that you've seen, and they're also used by people like me who are interested in the distribution of and the diversity of life in different places. And so I guess the very final point of this talk is that before you go outside in nature, you might want to familiarize yourself with what to expect. And a great way to do that is to look at the Hastings area or the Hillside area on iNaturalist, which is a citizen science tool where people record observations. And we're just now wrapping up the first annual Hastings Earth Month BioBlitz. And it was hugely successful, and we have a lot of cool observations from Hillside Woods that kind of resemble the state of the woods right now. So check that out, and you can kind of get a sense for where things are and what they look like. Then you can also keep up with recent bird sightings on eBird, which is another citizen science tool that's kind of bird focused. But there's a Hillside Woods hotspot that you can find. And with that, thanks for your attention, and thanks to everyone who helped me put this on. Be happy to take questions.
I just have a comment. This is Haven speaking. Patrick, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. It was beautiful to see your little trip through the woods there, and to note the items that that you carefully observed. It was really fantastic. Normally these sessions are about half an hour, and our half an hour is just about up, but we do have a few minutes. If anyone has any questions, to please write it in the chat box. There's a chat icon at the bottom, should be a chat icon at the bottom of your screen. So you're getting a bunch of thank yous. I guess your talk was thorough and understandable. And
Can I interrupt?
you can.
This is Elisa. What is happening? Because I've had the pleasure, and if none of you have, when we can all get out together again, go lopping and pulling a privet with Patrick. It's a lot of fun. What is happening these days, given the pandemic, in the woods? Is there any work being done, or checking being done, or any schedule of getting back to it?
So I can speak to this, and you, Haven, might be able to speak to this even better than I can. Right now the important thing is for people to not be in groups in the woods, and so it's all on pause right now. And so presenting this talk, on one hand, it's a great time to be exploring the woods because it's one of the few accessible things that there are, but it's really important to do this not in big groups. And so unfortunately for now, I think our ability to remediate is on pause temporarily.
Yeah, I'm gonna, it was put on hold for now. Bronwyn, you have a question? Your hand is up.
Oh, yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Am I unmuted? Okay, great. I just typed it in too. Patrick, thank you so much for this. While we're indoors, I'm taking online courses from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology.
Cool.
And they're great classes. I really recommend them to everyone. They're not very expensive, and they're very thorough, and I'm learning so much. And what I wondered was, when we can go out again, will you lead bird watching walks in Hillside or elsewhere in the area?
Yeah, I really hope to. I guess yes, I really hope to. I've wanted to do that around here for a really long time. I think an important first step is kind of establishing a group of people who like to do that. And I think that group of people is here. And also, I don't want to reinvent the wheel, and there are already a lot of people in the area who do stuff like this. So the Lower Hudson River Audubon Society is active. They meet very close by, and they have usually a bunch of bird walks around this time of the year. And unfortunately, those are all canceled for the foreseeable future as well. Right. But yeah, that Audubon branch is pretty active. And then I think it'd be fun to informally organize some here in Hastings as well that are maybe specific to documenting the life that's in Hillside Woods.
Yeah, that's what I would really like to start with. Thank you. That would be great.
The two other questions from the chat box. One is, have you seen many mushrooms? And have you seen the flock of turkeys in the woods? Are they still there?
Mushrooms. Yes, there are mushrooms in the woods. I don't know anything about mushrooms, so that's kind of like, that's the frontier for me. And so maybe if someone is listening right now and has a lot of mushroom background knowledge, that would be, feel free to chime in. But there definitely are. I know Devin Cummings, a local naturalist, has talked a little bit about juniper rust, which is a fungus that is growing on a cedar tree somewhere nearby. And a flock of turkeys. No, I haven't seen a flock of turkeys. But again, this is one of those things that we can only, you sometimes have to find by going outside consistently. So maybe over the next month or so, I'll be able to find them.
Right, when the serendipity hits.
Right.
And Taro has said in the chat that he could do a walk at the end of the quarantine. That would be fantastic. And Taro is also a mycologist, so if someone's more interested in mushrooms, he may be able to speak to exactly that. So I think that it's a little after 5, so I just want to thank everyone for joining. And there are some spots where you can see chicken of the woods in late summer, according to Muriel. You see, we have an amazing hive mind here of observers of the natural world, and it's just fantastic to kind of use this platform to put people together. So everyone stay in touch. Patrick, thank you so much for putting this presentation together, especially with all of the work that you've had to be doing recently for your doctorate. And I want to thank everyone for spending time with us this afternoon, and happy end of April to all.
Wait, Haven, before we finish, I just want to plug out for tomorrow's talk. And then do we have any more after tomorrow?
Tomorrow's our last scheduled talk. We will eventually have one on pollinator pathways.
Okay.
But please plug for tomorrow, because that's a great one too.
Tomorrow's talk is on climate change and international conflicts and mediation around the conflicts on climate change by Joe Siegel. So I should
Thanks,
be
Haven.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everybody. See you tomorrow at 4 to 5 or 4:30 to 5.
Thank you.
Be well, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Again, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick.
And this talk is has been recorded, and it will be up on our website online. If you need the link or any other questions, just email the Conservation Commission. Thanks so much.
Night.